everyone, and welcome back to LycanhoodReads. My name is Michaela, and thank you all for joining me today. Today I'd like to do a quick little review of a book called Pennyblade, and that is by J.L. Worrad. This is a book that I got to read by the pool in June while I was house sitting for my parents. I pretty much flew through it, really enjoyed it at the time. It was a good reading experience, but I have to say that by the end I was feeling pretty conflicted about this book overall. It had been a little bit hyped for me because it was on my one of the most anticipated reads of this year for me, a new release. I was of course drawn in by this fantastic cover. I don't remember when I first saw this cover, but it must have been sometime during 2021 because this book was already on my list when I went looking at the beginning of 2022. That tagline at the top says exile, mercenary, lover, monster. So there's a lot to be excited about there. So when I finally got my hands on it, I just dove in, totally excited. Didn't really do much research into the author or anything else about it. So I kind of went into this book expecting J.L. Worrad to be a woman. That was a poor assumption on my part. J.L. Worrad actually stands for James Worrad, is another name he goes by. So this book is written by a male author. So Pennyblade is an assassin, basically. A Pennyblade in this world is, maybe assassin's not the right word, they're mercenaries. So they're just sort of swords or muscle for hire. They're called Pennyblades because their blades are sold for money. Worrad's fantasy world is one that is very grimdark. It is crass and brutal and very violent, but also at times quite funny. And I could say all the same things for his main character, Kira, in this book. So Kira is actually part of a different civilization outside of human society. They're kind of like elves is really the best way that they are to describe them. That's how the book describes them, but they're called kamarks. I don't know why they're not just called elves, but they are. They live apart from the human population in this world and kind of are very snooty and basically despise humans. There's not a whole lot of interaction between humans and these elf-like creatures. And Kira is one of their elites, or at least she was. She was kind of a scion of one of their royal noble families, with a lot of privilege, a lot of money, and just a really toxic environment of being like haughty and rich. But she also had a lot of duty on her shoulders. Duty on her shoulders. She also had a lot of responsibility on her shoulders, kind of like the whole legacy of her family depending on her, and her twin brother, of course. And so this book takes place between the present, where she's working as a mercenary in the human world, and her past in the society where she grew up, and kind of how she got from one place to another. So the book flip-flops between those and flashbacks. And while a part of me really loves Kira, she's funny and crass and somewhat badass, even though she's pretty helpless without her sword, which is at times funny in and of itself. I really just have some issues with her as a character. The main one being that while she is a sapphic character, she is very much so written like a privileged, toxic frat boy sort of personality. And this is pointed out to her several times, either by herself or by other characters in the book. But she never really makes any course corrections about that. It's kind of like, oh, this is a character flaw, we're just going to roll with it. So I think one of the biggest complaints that this book is going to get, at least from the sapphic community, is that it's a lesbian main character, but she is very much so and very obviously written by a man. And sort of the way that she looks at other women, the way she treats women, and the way she's attracted to women doesn't feel particularly sapphic, if I'm being honest. I'll also load down this review with quite a bit of trigger warnings. This book is extremely violent. There is sexual violence. There is a lot of just other weird graphic sexual stuff. Not all of it violent, but this species of elves, they have a mating cycle that kind of reminds me of like ABO sort of dynamics, where they all go into heat at one point, and I will warn you that there is a extensive orgy, weird heat orgy in this book. And I'm not against all of that weird sexual stuff, it's just that some of it was rapey. there were some rapey vibes, and in general, it's just kind of a lot, really. So if you don't feel like you could handle that, that's here. I'll also go ahead and warn you there is a fair amount of homophobia. Some of the main antagonists to Kira's story in this book is a religious group, the church that is kind of dominant in the human world. They have a lot of power and they're after her for the majority of this book. There's also a character we spend a lot of time with that is one of the sort of priestesses of this church, and they are pretty classically homophobic in that way. They're constantly condemning her for being a lady-loving devil. Not to mention that there's a lot of race stuff towards the elves in this book, so they hate her because she likes women, but also because she's an elf, and also because she's a Pennyblade. The weird thing is that the homophobes in this book are a lot of the ones that are criticizing the way Kira behaves, but they're not wrong. Like, because she is not a good person. Morally gray is fine, but she's also just not treating people well in this book. There are a lot of things that she does that I find unfortunate. I think in one of the very first scenes, maybe even the first scene with Kira, she's like trying to convince this innkeeper's wife to sleep with her, even though the innkeeper's wife doesn't seem particularly interested. She's all but forcing herself on her before they get interrupted, and that's kind of our introduction to the character. We're meant to look at her as like a womanizer, which is fun and fine, but she is aggressive and entitled in a very unpleasant way. There are more instances like that in this book that I'm just kind of looking at like, how am I supposed to feel about this? Am I supposed to be rooting for her? Like, what am I thinking? Is this like, I don't know what we're doing with this character other than that I wish she would stop. I'll also warn you that there is some unfortunate incesty stuff in this book. Not by the main character, but there is a scene in which there is some very unfortunate incesty stuff that happens. So just a general warning for the sexual content in this book. It's weird, taboo, and sometimes unpleasant. Beyond that, I want to talk a little bit about Kira's love interest, or at least the romantic arc that goes on in this book. Most of the romantic arc takes place in the flashbacks, so when Kira is on this island, this society of elves, and she is the entitled sort of warrior princess, privileged nobility, she is intrigued by one of the servants in her household, and they start this sort of promising cat and mouse romance where the servant is not as completely in love with her and just falling all over herself the way that everyone else is for Kira. She's pretty used to getting exactly what she wants, and this one girl is really just not that interested. And so they set up this cat and mouse dynamic, and then the love interest says something like, you're gonna have to work for it, you're gonna have to court me. And then we go back to the other timeline, and the next time we get in the flashback, they're together. And it's like months later, they're together, and the courting that I was promised is over. So I felt a little bit robbed. I was really looking forward to that courtship and to watching Kira earn it, essentially. And we just completely missed that. So we just skip over it, and after that, it feels very much so like insta-love, or just infatuation. Their relationship didn't have much substance for me. I didn't really understand why they were in love with each other than the fact that they had some chemistry at the beginning of the book, but they don't really get to know each other much beyond that. And that relationship is a big driving force for Kira, especially in the flashbacks, but really throughout the entire book. I thought there were some more interesting threads in the present timeline that could have been pursued. Particularly, we're traveling with one of these priestesses of the church, and even though she is unpleasant and homophobic, you also sort of get the sense that it's a little bit of internalized homophobia, or at least that's how I was reading it. And I thought maybe pursuing that line a little more thoroughly would have been interesting. And maybe that's something Worrad wants to do in later books. I don't know if this is meant to be a standalone. The ending isn't a cliffhanger. It's pretty conclusive, but it also leaves room for there to be more if there is more. I have to admit that even though I had mixed feelings coming out of this book, I would say that if Worrad wanted to continue the story or continue writing in this world, I would be interested to see it. Just because I think the world is super cool. I like the humor, I like the violence and the crassness. If we could tone down the weird elf sex a little bit, that would be much appreciated. But in general, I think it's interesting. I think it's different than a lot of the grimdark that we're seeing right now. And I wouldn't be opposed to reading more, especially if I thought that Worrad might be able to learn from some of his mistakes in this book, and just be a little more thoughtful with the writing of Kira in particular. And this book does set her up well to have some character development later on. I just didn't feel like the character development really happened in this book. It kind of ends before she gets there. And I think that some of the side characters that we saw could have some interesting development, especially in relation to their relationship with Kira. There were some things that I wish had gotten more focused than the main romance, because the main romance stopped interesting me after a certain point. And I think there are more interesting avenues to be explored with this, especially in this world. So I would continue with this series if it gets some sort of continuation, but I did want to let you guys know that there is a lot of weirdness in this book, and it's probably not going to be what you expect in terms of like great sapphic fantasy. To sum it up, I did enjoy reading this book. However, it does have some problematic elements, particularly with its main character and just sort of its sexuality in this world. I also wanted to mention that the elven race, while they do have that unfortunate rapey mating cycle, is overall kind of gender fluid and very queer. They don't have the same gender binary norms that the human society does. In fact, they feel a lot of disdain towards humans because of the way that they treat women as an inferior sex. There are minor trans and non-binary characters. There are minor ace characters in the elven society. Again, these people aren't focused on, but just looking at the society as a whole, it is super problematic, it is super classist, but in terms of gender and sexuality, they are extremely fluid and open. I wanted to throw that in there as well. Overall, I would read more of this, but it might not be for everybody, and it is probably not going to be what you expect. Bomb cover, super interesting world, cool main character, if not a little bit problematic. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.